Hello, welcome to part 3 of a series I'm working on entitled What Does It Mean to Do Critical Theory Today? My name is Dr. Roger K. Green. I'm the founder and initiator of the Center for Critical Theory. I'm based in Denver right now, so sometimes you might see it as the Center for Critical and Cultural Theory of Denver. But these videos are obviously made for the web and for anyone. So if you get a chance, if you like what I'm doing, please support me on Patreon. I'm doing this as a non-funded endeavor right now, or except the few Patreon patrons that I have on Patreon. So if you're watching, thank you very much. Let's dive in here. I'm going to share my screen. And we're going to talk about, in lecture 2, I talked about Hegel, and we've been getting to Marxian thought slowly. I talked about German Romanticism and idealism first, and in my first lecture I mentioned Marx, and all of this is to say, first, just try to be a little bit patient. I've if you're having questions about why are we dealing with these white European men, and how is that relevant to today, I just ask for a little bit of patience. But the easiest or the short answer there is that we don't really understand a lot of, especially the discourse around identity and identity politics today, without understanding the historical situation. And because I'm living in the United States and grew up in the United States and have had to deal with, to whatever extent I can rise above the ideological framing that I myself have grown up in, this is an ongoing process. And there is, of course, a lot of rhetorical posturing, or a lot of rhetorical presence for Marx and Marxian thought and communism in the U.S. thinking. My position, just to be very clear on this, is that the right-left binary that we use and that Marx used in his politics and that we still use very much today, which goes back to the French Revolution, probably should do a lecture on that, is outdated or archaic. And in order for you to sort of see what that is, and claiming that is not to say that I'm just neutral, right? that I can be totally objective or something. I'm not making those kinds of claims either. Giving the historical background helps set up the kind of broad waves of thinking, and especially the kind of the buffers of thinking that people get into, that people get trapped into, at times I think a little bit dogmatically, and so by dogmatic I mean just like unthinkingly. And this series and this endeavor that I'm working on in terms of critical and cultural theory is to push against the unthought, to push against the kind of knee-jerk reactions that we have to things. And one more thing I'll say about that, like, to claim, I still am of the opinion, which is kind of a 1960s endeavor, that not only is the personal political, which is kind of comes out of feminist movements of the 1960s, but that even to say that you are somehow objective or you can stand outside of politics is still a political positioning. So if we're dealing with critical and cultural theory, we're not dealing with it as theory in the world, theory just sort of out in outer space, but we're dealing with theory in practice and theory in the world. And that is really, I think, why Marx's work was so, his thought was so important, because it did definitely try to put into practice. If you've read his thesis on Feuerbach, he says the point of the work is to change the world. It's not just to analyze it. But I will say, I'm a historical thinker, and Marx is still important. He's especially important for historical framing. But to say that he's important is not to say that what I'm advocating for in the 21st century is just some sort of simple return to Marx, or like that there's a specter of Marx hanging over us still. I mean, I might be a little bit sympathetic to that type of idea, in the sense that I grew up in a household that with military figures. My dad was a Marine. My uncles were Marines. My brothers are Marines. And so there is, just growing up when I grew up in the United States, there was a heavy sort of inflection of Cold War ideology in the household that I grew up in, and I think it's probably what drives me. Like how did I come to be who I am? So if you're wondering, that's my personal stake in some of this. That's where that's coming from. If you remember back to lecture 2, I was talking about Hegel's philosophy of history, and I have Marx's dialectic pulled up here, but I've had Hegel's conception of history. And it's got this moving forward notion, and this is something that I think that even, my university students often come in and they've never really thought about, how much they have a conception of history and how much that informs how they expect the world to be. And what a lot of Americans have is a progressive notion of history. Now, I don't just mean that in terms of progressive liberalism. I mean it in terms of they think that the world is sort of getting better, as opposed to more pessimistic attitudes that the world is slowly going into decline. So, in the past 50 to 60 years, since the civil rights movements of the 60s, the general sort of liberal left in the United States, and this is my left here, have looked back to the 1960s for to say that this was a good time. This was like, and we need to keep progressing into the future, especially around issues of race or gender. It's like when people say it's 2022 now. I mean, gosh, like we're dealing with the possible fall of Roe v. Wade, or something like that. That kind of the framing around that. I mean, I might agree to a certain extent with those politics, but what I'm after is thinking about the framing of thinking that we're using. So when we think like, how could we be going back this far, right? That notion of a kind of linear progressive model, which isn't to say that that is like a horrible thing to have, but it is to say that you should know how you are thinking. You should know what your expectations are. In the very wrongly described ideas of critical race theory, for example, today, which I will do future lectures on, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time today. Critical race theory, what is presented in the national news media by the right wing currently in the United States, has nothing to do with what critical race theory is. It's like fascinating that it has this buzzword, right? So there's a lot of control over the rhetoric around using that, and so we have to address it. I'm addressing it right now, right? But what is being addressed in the national news media is not what people like Derek Bell were advocating necessarily when they came up with critical race theory. So that is another sort of thing, is like the decontextualizing things that we find ourselves in. Partly we can say it's the internet and all sorts of different ways to think about it. But if we step back a little bit more, I want to, just to finish that thought with critical race theory. I mean, Derek Bell and those folks were kind of anti-progressivist when it came to thinking about racist presence, right? So, or the presence of racism in society from a critical race theory perspective is that racism is embedded into and always part of society, which is a really important sort of distinction to have, because a lot of people come in and they're like, why do we still have racism today, right? Like that's that progressive conception. And then they get exhausted or frustrated or like, oh, there's nothing we can do about it. Like throw out my hands about racism or sexism or whatever it happens to be, because there's this expectation that if there were something to be done with it, it would already be done, or what is possibly worse than that pessimistic attitude is the idea that because things are just progressing towards the future and always getting better, things will just work themselves out. And that is the kind of thinking that I think almost like the vast majority of my university students in the past 19 years of teaching college have thought. They've come in with the idea that things are progressing, and that they don't have to then do anything about it because things will just work themselves out. And that's a way to not have to think about things, right? So that's what critical theory wants us to find ways to think about things. So addressing these European thinkers on the conception of history, I'm trying to show what might be sort of informing some of us and our conceptions about the world and how it might work. Now, is this to say that Hegel is the only person that we should look at, or Marx is the only person? No, not at all. There are thinkers who are important and influential thinkers of their time, but they are capturing quite a bit more of culturally what I think is informing and continues to inform our political situation today. It is certainly what informs the rise of the Soviet Union and eventually the Cold War. And yes, the Cold War, we might say, is over, but I think that what we are dealing with right now in this milieu is a vast shifting in the ways that the global power relationships work because of the end of the Cold War. Now, there's a lot more to be said about that, and I'm not going to go there because this is more of a historical lecture. But all of that is just to give you a little bit of an intro of where I'm going with this kind of 200, 300-year-old history of where we've been in terms of critical theory. So today, we've already talked about Hegel, so go back to the earlier lectures to talk about Hegel. All I wanted to show you was that there's something, with this model of history that we see very much informing Marx, which is one, that history moves in a linear fashion, and that there is, along with history, there is a notion of progress. Now, the terminology for Hegel for this was dialectic, through thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and I gave a lecture on a basic lecture on the master-slave hypothesis, and that what accompanies this and what's important for Hegel is a notion of reason, and a notion. I keep using the word notion, but at least in English translations, a notion is the entire concept of a thing in its existence from beginning to end, right? So it's not just a static, transcendent thing. There is a kind of progress relationship even within the idea of a notion. But the thing that drives the notion to be clarity is what he will call reason. And so capital R reason, which is not the same thing, just to be very clear, as Enlightenment reason, which was Immanuel Kant, who was popular before Hegel came along. So he's trying to account for culture, and particularly Hegel was trying to account for, in my earlier lecture, German pietism and German theology, and that's what they were going to say. They were going to have this kind of notion of what becomes folkishness, or Volk, the people that they're developing in the 1800s, and along with that, they want to capture what is it that makes Germans Germans, right? Now that they're not as formulated as a kind of nation state in Germany during most of the 1800s as France and England, and so there's a competition going on there as well. But it's always been an endeavor in the Romantic era and to critique the Enlightenment, to have a kind of counter-Enlightenment, as one of the great thinkers, Isaiah Berlin, I think, terms it. So when we look at Marx's dialectical materialism, so if Hegel was idealism, Hegel was like the self needs to come to self-knowledge by looking at itself and posturing itself in relation to itself, and then moving on and overcoming through dialectic this understanding of how things work in the world. There is a sense in idealism, if I'm going to be very kind of crass here, there is a sense that the world, because the world is just the unfolding of God doing that self-discovery process, God's own self, that all we need to do is to do that in our minds, that the world kind of outside doesn't really matter so much as the internal dialogue of us through a kind of imitation of God, or even an imitation of Christ, sort of maneuvering through the force of understanding that's going to characterize his thought. Now, Marx doesn't like the idealistic side of this. He's very influenced by Hegel, and so we can see that very clearly in his theory of history. But what he, in a very sort of 101 sense, what Marx's critique of Hegel and the idealists was, they're too idealistic, right? He says that the point of trying to understand history is to change it. In this short thing that I'm not reading in detail with you all right now, but his thesis on Feuerbach is where you would look for that. Feuerbach, another very great thinker, influential thinker, but that I'm not going to go into today. Ludwig Feuerbach. So dialectical materialism becomes the name for Marx's theory of history. And what we see, this is, you can watch like lots of YouTube videos and, like great courses, lectures on this kind of stuff. And so what we see very basically, quickly here, is that back in time, so this is the bottom of his model here, you have unorganized society, and then you have tribes developing, and from the tribes there's a division of labor. So we're moving from just like completely unorganized society maybe then to hunters and gatherers, where there's a kind of separation in roles between who's hunting and who's gathering, and then eventually some sort of agricultural situation, and that the tension between those two ends up in this early like classical notion of empire. Think of things like the Persian Empire, right, and the Egyptian Empire, and then there becomes a conflict between who is inside the empire and then the barbarians outside of the empire. And this is characterized as the era of slavery, because what empires do is they keep growing, or they, in that conflict with barbarians, are pulling the barbarians into the empire and enslaving them. And then there's this much more of a heavy distinction between forced labor and the ruling classes. And that would characterize, through the end of the Roman Empire. And then you have this is maybe late medieval, you have a landed aristocracy that develops. It's different in different places, so this is a very broad sketch he's giving. And the emergent classes of bourgeoisie. And so this, we could have several lectures on this time period, but what is happening is that people they've gotten better at farming, especially after there's a warm wave in that hits Europe. Like a warm temperature wave that after around 1000, and it changes the kind of the temperature of and allows farming to be a lot better during this time period. So there's a lot of material conditions that I think Marx would appreciate that he didn't necessarily know, that inform the growth of a kind of more productive sense of farming. And with that, there are cities that develop, and people are developing more and more skills that are particular trade skills and particular professions, starting guilds and things like that. And that is going to eventually produce this notion of the bourgeoisie. This is the era, of course, of feudalism. So it's like, the little triangle can go over several hundred years. But there does seem to be a little bit of a, if you look really hard at it, it does seem to like be speeding up a little bit. And I think that there's a lot to say about that, the speeding up of notions of history. So then you have bourgeoisie, democracy, the arrival of nation states, and eventually the Industrial Revolution, and the creation of the proletariat, which is Marx's term for the working class, but I'm going to say something specifically about what that means in a little bit here. And he says that we're going through this right now. This is his conception, and that the future is going to be the overcoming of capitalism itself. He thinks that he's doing this descriptively and not just because he wants it to happen. And I think maybe that shifts a little bit throughout his career. He's more idealistic as he's younger. He's more romantic as he's younger. But as he writes these massive volumes on Capital, in 3 volumes, only one was published in his lifetime, he really thinks that he's doing a science. And he does a lot of studying. And for that alone, I think that Marx is worth paying attention to and taking seriously, because the guy knew a lot. He wasn't necessarily a nice person, and that's not a claim that I'm making, or I'm not going to go into his biography today. Wasn't the best, husband, and for sure. But I'm going to kind of step outside of that. I'm just dealing with his influence on thought and politics today. So in this era of capitalism, there will be a tension that grows and grows between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And the bourgeoisie becomes the capitalists. Now, spending money or having money is not the same thing as being a capitalist. And this is something that, like, on the street discussions is just so annoying. Sometimes the capitalism is not about, the capitalist is not the person who just is rich. Okay, the capitalist is the one who owns the means of production. And so, yes, it does take money, but think about it like starting a business and getting a business loan. You want somebody to put capital into your business. You want investors. Even the biggest capitalists lately, like Elon Musk, was still looking for funders for buying Twitter, which he could have opened up his wallet. I guess he's rich enough and just bought it. But no, he wanted to buy it in terms of this process of capitalism, right? So that's partnered with other people. So capitalism is always about a kind of social relationship and social process, even though there are values that come along with capitalism that might stress the individual. I don't think anything really works with just individuals, and you can challenge me on that, I suppose, if you like. But especially not capitalism. The corporations are formed early on, and so back at the, towards the end of feudalism, you start getting more and more investment groups. You get the big companies, the East India Company in England. Eventually you get national banks that come out of this. And so that there's a whole new way of thinking about economy that arises in the late 1600s. And because of that whole new way of thinking about economy, we're thinking about people who gather together as shareholders and they invest in companies expecting a return in the future, right? And so that is a big part of what capitalism is. Eventually, as you may know, Marx says that there's going to be more and more of a conflict arising between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, because there will be people who cannot make it as bourgeoisie people in capitalist society. And so they become more and more, they lose their money, they lose their business, they lose their house, all sorts of things. And so what there eventually there will be is a widened gap between the poor and the rich, and that will have its own sort of, re-sparking of the earlier master-slave dialectic with Hegel, in which the poor realizes that they should own the means of production, and therefore they should take over. There should be a revolution, and that would be the end of capitalism. So that's Marx's theory of dialectical history in very, very short terms. I mean, I could spend a lot more time on it, but my goal here is to eventually get to what does this mean for critical thinking today. Well, one thing that I think that it definitely means is that it's still got this linear progressive notion of history. Some people will characterize Marxism and eventually 20th century communism, which is not exactly the same thing. So Leninism is not the same thing, I will say. And I think it's just important to have these distinctions. Of course, he's a Marxist and he thinks that he's doing Marxist stuff. But, of course, like Joseph Stalin claimed he was doing Marxist stuff. And what happens with Stalin for sure doesn't look like Marxism to me anyway. And that's not a sort of, attempt to kind of just to recover a more pure kind of Marxism on my part, but it is to address, because there's so much rhetoric in the United States about like the evils of communism. There's a lot more to be said for what it was and why it was such a powerful force in the 20th century. And how it shaped global politics and still continues in some ways to reverberate today. So, as I've said, this lecture is not a valorization of Marx. It's largely descriptive and historical, but it's annoying to me and that I have to speak to this stuff and like say like, please, give Marx a chance or something. It's like, don't just ignore something because your parents or your family or the culture you grew up in called it stupid. There are a lot of issues of inequality that he was trying to address. I think that, even just the fact that I have to even say that speaks to some of the ideological difficulties of doing critical theory today. So we can't understand contemporary politics or world history today if we don't know anything about Marxism. Remember that the Frankfurt School, going back to lecture 1, were concerned with the critical or cultural critique in response to revolution, not to the Marxian revolution, right, to the end of capitalism, not taking hold in Germany. And so, there have been various revolutions that made it seem like Marx was really on to something in the 1800s, So he doesn't start it. It's not because he writes the Communist Manifesto with his friend Friedrich Engels in 1848. Their pamphlet comes out before all of these revolutions happen all over Europe. So, and they weren't people who had read Marx's pamphlet, but Marx was obviously tapped into something in the cultural moment. And then, so, you have the overthrowing of the French Republic, the establishment of Napoleon III, Napoleon's nephew. So we have shifts in the Republic in France. Then later in the 1860s, we have the rumblings we have the Prussian Empire, and then what is eventually forming into Germany, as we might know it more in the 20th and 21st century context, sort of building up. So there's a war between Prussia and France. There's a lot of fighting over that territory around where Stuttgart is, a city in depending on the time period, is either in France or Germany. Beautiful place. And then in 1871, you have a Paris Commune. So you have like the people in Paris after the defeat in the Franco-Prussian War. You have these people taking to the streets and claiming it for themselves as a kind of self-ruled city-state for a time period. And so there are lots of earlier precursors to what we might think of as 20th century efforts towards communism that seemed to be dealing with Marx's thought, and it seemed like something, like he was on to something, and he would probably be the first one to say that, like, it doesn't happen exactly, it's not exactly linear, but he would come back and say what went wrong with various different efforts, such as the Paris Commune, although he was encouraged by the Paris Commune. We know, just to go back to the Frankfurt School, we know that those folks, we saw there's a Russian Revolution in 1917 at the end of World War One. Part of that effort comes out of Germany trying to get the Tsar off its back, right, during World War One. And so Lenin, who ends up becoming like the party figure, comes through Switzerland and Germany to so he's been ousted from Russia as a political dissident, and then he comes back in. So he's there. There have been multiple parties, the internationals, the communist internationals. There have been a few conferences, and there's a sense at the time that if Marx is right, it's not going to be about nationalism itself. It's going to be about world revolution. So they're very much globalists. And so when we think about globalization today, we want to think about Marxists as early adopters of a globalization theory that didn't necessarily come true for them, but they were already thinking that way. And so there are definitely differences in the Communist Party at the time. So Rosa Luxemburg, for example, who is murdered just at the end of World War One in Germany. She's Polish, but she's an ardent international person. So the international movement actually became kind of devastated with the outbreak of World War One, because what happened was you have this entrenchment of people into nation states and nationalism again. And so anytime there's a refraction or an inward looking for people within a region to their own self-interests, then that is going to hurt the people who are devout Marxists, right? Who want to see that what will happen is something that happens to all of human society. It will not just be this one particular region. And Marx, of course, one of the main things that he had said was that the true revolution was going to have to come from a rich place, a post-industrial country. And so there are all these different ways to think about it. So why does Marxism take hold in a very much agrarian society like Russia with Lenin? And why doesn't it take hold in Germany? Because the expectation of the Frankfurt School was like, yeah, there are some rumblings over in Russia, but we're still going to need a major industrialized country that's educated, that has all sorts of resources to be able to do it. Now, at the end of World War One, of course, Germany was devastated, and there was fighting in Germany between the extreme leftists, the Marxist radicals, and the social democrats. So socialism ends up coming emergent. So it flirts with the same ideas as Marxian communism, but the distinction here is, very broadly speaking, is that socialism can be more gradual, and it doesn't necessarily need to have all of the world go into a revolution at the same time. And so for the radical Marxists, the socialists are kind of like they do too much appeasing of the capitalist society, and they slow the progress down of moving toward a communist society. So the Frankfurt School wondered, why didn't, so at first there's a imposed liberal democracy on Germany called the Weimar Republic, and this is in the 1920s, and at first, the economy is totally devastated, as any countries would be after a war, but then there's a big boom in the economy and things start looking up, and then there are the market crashes of the late 20s, and so everything becomes quite chaotic again. And so the idea for the Marxist thinkers were that this imposition of liberal democracy has more to do with the emergent influence of the United States and the West encroaching to have control in their region of Germany, and which they don't like, but they kind of have to deal with it because the alliance, the Allied forces, are the ones who break the radical leftists and allow for the Weimar Republic to come into power. So this is kind of this middle. I will call that the liberal way. So liberalism, not like modern politics like right and left in the United States, who call the left liberals. No, liberalism is an economic system. And the Social Democratic Party, which was Germany had come into power at the time, are the ones who end up being in power for a while until eventually Hitler comes to power in the early 1930s. And so the question for critical theorists was like they thought that they understood how society was going. Following Marx, they could understand why the world wouldn't go into global revolution after Russia, but why didn't Germany follow Russia, right? So it's a very technical question. And I said that one of their answers back in lecture 1 is that they thought that Marx hadn't quite gotten a hold of the notion of culture. And yes, maybe if you're a strict Marxist or something, you could say well, in his later work and his later, stuff, it's yeah, but you have to remember that the Marx that even people like Lenin were working with were not all of Marx as we have it today. So in the 1930s, there is an explosion of rereading Marx and thinking about, trying to maybe recover in some ways a humanist Marx or a more sympathetic Marx, a softer romantic Marx, as opposed to what had become very, very formulaic and almost like mathematical coldness that had arisen with some of the influences in the Soviet Union, that people could just kind of be digitized as numbers, that even the question of culture, will there be something like a Soviet culture, a proletariat culture, there's no, we won't have any culture. And then there was debates between Lenin, who felt like it was enough to have the old culture of Europe to entertain people, but then you have Trotsky, who's a little bit more of the cultural influenced thinker, as opposed to Stalin, who's much more of just the technocratic power grabbing type of person that Stalin was. So there's a lot of different trajectories that emerge. Now in Italy, there is this thinker named Antonio Gramsci, who I have next here on the my handout or my notes. And Gramsci, like the Frankfurt School guys, he is influenced by this kind of cultural turn in Marx that happens in the 1930s, or in Marxist thinking. And he comes up with this term that we use a lot today called cultural hegemony. So I've got some definitions I pulled here. I'm just going to read them off. In Marxist philosophy, cultural hegemony is the domination of a culturally diverse society by the ruling class who manipulate the culture of that society. So this is the beliefs, the explanations, the perceptions, the values, and the mores. So that their imposed ruling class worldview becomes the accepted cultural norm, the universally valid dominant ideology, which justifies the social, political, and economic status quo as natural and inevitable, perpetual and beneficial for everyone, rather than as an artificial social constructs that benefit only the ruling class. So, one way to think about this is that hegemony, you could think of it as the powers that be, but that the powers that be they're not just capitalists who own the means of production, but they own, in owning the means of production, they also own the production of everything that we receive culturally. So it's not just the food that we eat or the houses that we live in, but it's the entertainment that we are brought up on. And that entertainment is always sort of going to be shaped by allegiance in some sort of way to the cultural elite that expresses the values of the ruling class, right? And so this definitely, you can see it in literature in the late 1800s and early 1900s. You can see this kind of distinction. So there was a really broad explosion in literacy, for example, in the late 1800s, even in places like England. So one of my degrees is in English literature, and you have kind of a distinction between this new class of authors that kind of are following out of the Charles Dickens realm, and this kind of gets into like why, you know, Marx was living in England, but he wasn't that influential in England because England kept finding ways to sort of compromise against the really crass capitalism of the 19th century. It found ways to appease people. And so when you think about the sympathetic novels like Charles Dickens and dealing with orphans and poor people, and the way that you can find your way up through society, their version of the Bildungsroman becomes part of this art or culture that ideologically reflects the ruling class in England, right? That says like, oh, well, you know, if you have a really good heart and you're Pip from Great Expectations, generally things are going to work out in the end. Now, it's not the way it works out in the end for Pip, except like it doesn't, if you've ever read Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, you know that there's like a famous ending problem. So his novels were serialized and Pip doesn't win out in the end in the original ending, but Dickens readers were so angry that Pip didn't win out in the end that he rewrote a new ending. If that's not like a really good example of like the masses sort of like adhering to a hegemonic cultural ideal that says you can like pull yourself up by your bootstraps, type of thing. You can make your way from being very poor into a middle class, for example. I don't know that if that's not a really great example, I don't know of a better one right at the moment. But in the late 19th century, you get an explosion of popular authors. So Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, like the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, for example, Robert Louis Stevenson and Stevenson's Treasure Island, so Sherlock Holmes, all of these explosion, and this becomes a kind of literary distinction between those types of works and the emergent so-called high modern works that are kind of reacting to some of the stuff in Germany and this discussion around high modern culture, and so you see that showing up a lot in E.M. Forster's book. So the sisters in Howard's End, for example, who come from Germany. You get a little bit of this, a much more socialist derived book like Love and Mr. Lewisham, I think by H.G. Wells, right? It's Wells, who is this kind of like not very well educated character who's like, I'm an anarchist, or I'm a socialist, and I'm going to do really good, and I'll use that, I'll be the writers are using that kind of a figure as the hero during this period in literature, and you've got like the kind of richer, that you've got an upper class society that's sympathetic to the poor, right? In Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Grahame, which is a really great book. It's one of my favorite books. You have Mole and Ratty, and they're kind of the lower rungs of society. But especially Mole is the very well-to-do, kind of like lower middle class. Like, he's got good values. He doesn't hate anybody. And he's going and he's talking to all of these other people, and then they come up with like the more educated, and as the animals kind of represent figures. The figures who represent like Otter, for example, who has a kind of wisdom about him. He's kind of more like the professor type or older, but also is more like the English, one version of English gentleman. But what is problematic in Wind in the Willows is Toad, Mr. Toad, who's just kind of like capitalism, like irresponsible aristocracy, colonialism, off the rails. And so there's this shift in England in the late Victorian, early Edwardian era, where the literature is doing the work of what Marx would say, or maybe not Marx himself, but the later Marxists like Gramsci would say that of course that we see these kinds of novels and this kind of media being put out because it ameliorates the situation in England. It makes the people who are in England who are like, I don't want to be part of this like widespread British Empire that the sun never sets on. I'm just a humble mole person. Can't we just like look back to ourselves? Can't we just like be a little bit more humble in the way that we live in the world? And so you have that kind of tendency going on at the same time that you have in a book like Love and Mr. Lewisham, you have like these sisters who are like older, like upper class, and they're like, we got to give this lower class guy a chance. I mean, he could be a genius. He could be the genius. He could be the next Marx. Maybe that's not exactly that kind of romantic story. I mean, H.G. Wells is really amazing. So all of that is just I popped over into the literary world right there, just to give a sense of what hegemony is. So we will eventually get to what the Frankfurt School calls the culture machine or the culture industry. And they start looking very much at Hollywood. So it's movies and popular culture that way that they feel like is doing the work of hegemony, which is foisting onto the masses a uncritical attitude by making people, sort of brainwashing people to align their values with the dominant capitalist society. So back to my notes here. In philosophy and in sociology, the term cultural hegemony has denotations and connotations derived from ancient Greek, the word hegemonia, right? Hegemonia, indicating leadership and rule. And then in politics, for example, hegemony is the geopolitical method of indirect imperial dominance, with which the hegemon or the leader state rules subordinate states by the threat of intervention and implied means of power rather than by direct military force, that is, invasion, occupation, and annexation. So broadly speaking, to bring this a little bit more into contemporary times, what we see throughout the 20th century after World War I and World War II is the devastation of Europe twice in the century is what helps bring the United States into its hegemonic place in the society. And it's been that way basically since the end of World War II. And the U.S. as a entity of a world power has had hegemony over lots of different places. Now, it practices its hegemony differently in different places in the world, but it uses its influence throughout South America, for example. It used like we get eruptions of things around Cuba in the early 60s with the missile crisis and stuff, but that's already with the Cold War. So you get after World War II, you get even more of a split between the Soviets and the U.S., and then the U.S. is kind of standing in for the West. So that terminology gets used over and over again. What do we mean by the West or Western civilization? The reason why people talk about it all the time is because of Western hegemony and the question of whether or not Western hegemony is going away, with the fact that we have China has it's very close all the time, but like a bigger economy, and in some cases than the United States. And so we are seeing this moment of global turmoil right now, and questions about whether or not, what's China's relationship to Russia, to Stalin, or sorry, not to Stalin, excuse me, to Putin. He's like, Putin's been doing some authoritarian types of moves lately. So, a lot of times, like, so one of the things that's caught Americans off guard in recent months, since the war in Ukraine, is that other nations in Asia, like India, who they have thought, in a foreign policy sense, that India allied its values with the West, with the U.S., and India has been a little bit more reluctant to just align with the U.S. pressure that they're putting on against Putin, because if you're thinking about being in India today, it's like, well, if they align with the United States, they've got like Pakistan up to their up like northwest of them, and they have China northeast of them. And if China sides with Russia, and then India has sided with the U.S., it's like, the U.S. is not going to, because of like various like long historical and racial colonial reasons, probably not really going to stand in and defend India. Then India's kind of screwed, right? So we're in that kind of game in 2022. So understanding what hegemony is on the global stage and why the U.S. has it has very much to do with the fallout of the Cold War in the 20th century, and the different ways people have advanced upon what they think of as the so-called end of the Cold War, which ends with the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, right? But the idea was that, okay, well, communism lost, and so now everything's going to be great, right? And for a while it is. And so in the 1990s, you get the dot-com boom, you get like people are making all sorts of money, and then you've got this crash. And then in 2001, you get 9/11. And so you start getting all of these different forms of states of emergency. I'll have different lectures on that start characterizing things. So, the war on terror arises as a way to try and reignite a kind of sense of like, we're the West, we're the good guys, and they're the bad guys over there. So it's this Manichaean good versus evil type of foreign policy conception that the U.S. often tells itself and tells its citizens. And so you have operations infinite justice, operations enduring freedom, right? Those are the policy initiatives of U.S. foreign policy in the early 20th century under George W. Bush, and they are very much the rhetorically framed as though we are the good guys, like we just want to bring freedom to the world. But outside of the U.S., of course, there is this very, very much more real politics is the term here. There is a very aggressive foreign policy that the US has had in the world and continues to have today, but that most American citizens don't have any sense about. We are not taught about it unless you specifically go into college and become a political science major, or want to be dealing with foreign policy. And so this becomes very hard in terms of the United States, like Americans in the United States, for trying to understand what our place is in the world. I mean, I remember being like, I must have been in my early 20s when 9/11 happened, and I remembered, thinking that before then, when I was like late teenager, that there will be no more wars, no more wars. We don't need wars anymore. They're a thing of the past. We had World War I and World War II, and we aren't going to have something like World War III because we've risen above that. That was my own progressivism. I mean, you can make fun of me. It's okay. in my early 20s, and so. I could recognize, I did have enough wherewithal to recognize that that part of what was happening at 9/11 was a response to U.S. hegemony in the world, and the fact that the U.S. had been very aggressive with other nations, and it came back in many ways to bite the United States in the butt. But I, my idealistic younger Roger years thought like, well, why can't we like make amends? Like, why can't we say sorry? Why can't we like, why did that, like the age old, the American question, why do they hate us? Like that kind of thing. And that's just something that people have to go through because we are not, brought up in a way, even at least in our public school systems, we're not brought up in a way that teaches us to be critical. And I think that we are very much suffering from that because we don't, as a culture in the United States, we don't have an educated populace that knows how to address or think about even the global issues. We have people who are quick to be loud and bombastic about values, about certain things, to call someone a fascist, or this person's like, everybody just calls everybody else a fascist now, right? Like, Glenn Beck or whoever calls Biden a fascist. Biden calls Trump a fascist. They're all, so that's just like this slinging. We don't even know what that means for most of us in the United States. Most of my students don't know that much about World War II. For example, they certainly don't know much about indigenous genocide. And it's been calculated that way because I think we have divested in the idea of a public intellectual process in the United States and public education. We focused on STEM, technology, and all of the things that, certain people thought that it might take to keep winning in a competitive game where the U.S. remains on top as an aggressive nation in the world, as an aggressive world power. And so what we're seeing right now is the U.S. playing the good guy in Ukraine, for example, defending freedom, democracy from the colonial takeover. So now we're no longer colonizers anymore because we're supporting Ukraine against the colonizing efforts of Russia and its backwardness and Putin. So I'm not at all defending Putin, but I'm just characterizing U.S. right now. There's a lot of vilification of Putin that Putin is just this madman who is gone off his rocker. He's nostalgic for the old past. And he's just causing havoc in the world because he's going through this kind of Peter Pan concept, like he's throwing tantrums and wanting to have his way in the world. I think that's a much oversimplified, although I've said I'm not sympathetic with Putin, I think that's a really oversimplified notion of what is going on around the world, but it's too easy for the U.S., who sees in the news every day in the New York Times, it's like, we're giving more and more aid, more and more weapons, more and more financial support, things like that right now. and the U.S. is practicing its hegemony there, right? And hopefully it doesn't break out into more violence where the U.S. is more directly involved, although they are directly involved in the war right now. And so I think that there's a lot more to be said about that, and I want to come back to Marx here, but that's at least part of the reason of trying to understand this history is to understand where all these different inflections are coming from, and especially with words like totalitarianism and fascism, which are thrown around so easily and without people thinking that much about it. That's what the Center for Critical and Cultural Theory is about, especially is about getting us into a place where we can have more dialogue and thought about these issues. And the difficulty is that we are not trained in the United States to do this. The public is not trained in any kind of robust public sense to have critical theory. The divestment in the humanities was a effort that the right wing has won. I don't mean to say that we're completely done, but so far there's been a global shift. So it's not just in the United States, but we feel it in the United States. There's been a global shift to the right since the early 1970s, since about the time that we start seeing the word globalization showing up. In the United States, it's particularly a reaction against the civil rights gains of the 1960s. So it's a kind of revanchism or a revenge on that kind of broadening of the demos that was seen as necessary on the world stage. In terms of U.S. Foreign policy, it was necessary for us to show the rest of the world that we are better than Russia in terms of our human rights record by having these more expansive projects of civil rights that become more accepted, and integration, the end of Jim Crow, all of that sort of stuff. The U.S. at the time is trying to save face on the world stage against the USSR at the time, who was saying, you commit genocide against Indian people, you commit genocide against black people in the United States. And of course, the United States at the time was saying, you Russians have the Gulag, what becomes known as the Gulag Archipelago. You have the Gulag system, so you're the genociders. And then it goes back and forth. And of course, that's all in the fallout of the Holocaust. So we need to understand all of these things. So much stuff to think about. Let me come back a little bit more to Marx, and then I'll end things for today. Hegemony is the term for not just centralized power, but cultural hegemony is what we're really interested in. How do the powers that be create own the ownership, not just the ownership of the means of production, which is basic Marxism, but see culture within that as being created from, and I mean this all the way down to like Motley Crue and Kendrick Lamar and like your local indie band. Like that's what I mean by culture, not like just at the museums. I mean culture in its broad sense, all the way down to comic books, including Hollywood, what you listened to on your phone, what's playing in the supermarket when you go to hear things. So a few of my friends' songs, like this guy, I don't know if they're quite, well, one of them's my friend. My friend Nathaniel Rateliff is often on in various public places. He's a singer. He has a band called the Night Sweats, and he's on a lot. And I know him, the person, but I also like him in this sort of space to see what is being done in the terms of like market domination of a particular mode of culture. Cultural texture. Another guy, not so much a close friend of mine or anything, but Isaac Slade from this band called, sorry, Isaac, The Fray. Denver bands, was I'm from Denver, who is always, like, every time I go into Safeway, they're playing a Fray song. And so it's just always there. So, like, they have become part of the hegemonic texture. Do I like these people as people? I like them. I like them as artists. I think that they're so I can say that. But how I will deal with them aesthetically, or when I turn on my critical theory hat, or my turn on my hat, when I put on my hat, critical theory hat, I maybe need to look at what's happening at the level of cultural texture to see, well, why this music? Why these lyrics? What does that do for people who are walking around in an almost unconscious level at the supermarket? So I will often use words like cultural texture. So let's go back to some basic Marxism here before I end. And so Marx came up with this idea that society works in this particular way, that there's a base structure and a superstructure. Now, in the classic Marxism, Marx would put art, I was just talking about music, into the superstructure. And so it's kind of, you can see these circles here, these arrows. It's kind of dialectical, right? In the base structure first, what you have are the means of production. These are the tools, the machines, the factories, the land, and the raw materials. So we would, there are relations of production in the base structure, which is the lumpen proletariat, the proletariat, labor aristocracy, petty bourgeoisie, and bourgeoisie. So those are the different classes that he had. And so what I want to be especially aware of is this notion of the lumpen proletariat, the wretched proletariat. It's a way that we can think about that, because Frantz Fanon, a great theorist of the negritude movement in the 20th century, is going to have a book called Wretched of the Earth, and what he's thinking of is Marx on the lumpen proletariat, with that title. So the lumpen proletariat is more like peasants. They're the uneducated masses who are just going about their ways, and they are, in Marx's theory, totally manipulated by the dominant society. They don't come to consciousness. They're so uneducated that they can't even be self-reflective. In some sense, he thinks in his most harsh moments, he just feels like these people are going to, like when the revolution comes, they're going to die off. And so there are ways to take that Marxian strain of thought and pull it into 20th century contexts of ethnic cleansing, where which is just, I mean, it's just a name for genocide, if you ask me, but the idea that what somebody who's doing so-called ethnic cleansing is doing is that they're cleansing to make way for something to come in the future, and so we should see that that impulse is throughout both the right and the left. It is not the property of just of just one particular political group. Then there's the proletariat, which are the workers, the people who actually have jobs and they're working in factories and they're making the world go round. Then there's the labor aristocracy and petty bourgeoisie. These are the people who own the businesses and the people who have made some money from starting their own businesses. They maybe aren't, they're new money versus the old money. And then the bourgeoisie, or the people who've made enough money that they don't really need to work anymore, but they've made it through the more recent owning of capital in some sort of way through means of production. And then you have these are the people who actually get to own the private property, the people who you rent your apartments from. they are the people who have the control of capital itself. They don't just have the cash in the hand, but they have the control of owning the property that makes more money, of the business and the land that the business is on, and the various tools that you need that the business has, the various machines necessary to make a business happen. They then own the market centers where commodities are bought and exchanged, and they control the pricing of the various different commodities, right? And so there's this constant relationship between the proletariat and the worker, and then the bourgeoisie. And now, I mean, like Marx can be very harsh about this idea of the lumpen proletariat, but he's just going to, like, in his vision, there's people are going to work, or they're going to be forced into forced labor. So we're all going to either become part of that, or we're going to die off. So I don't think that he's necessarily always wants just people to die off, but he sees that in the force of history, as he understands it, he sees some populations of people as going away. And I will be just descriptive about that. I don't think that he's necessarily advocating right away that people should be sort of actively exterminated, although I can see definitely from a liberal standpoint why somebody might take his logic there, because of just what happens with Stalinism, especially in the 20th century. So there's no reason, like I said, to make a hero out of Marx. It's just like to say, like, this is what's going on in his thinking, and look at the influence that it's had. Ultimately, what he wanted was liberation for people, of course, right? Through the proletariat, who were going to become so massive because the bourgeois people would start, there would be this gap between them and those just continuously widening, and that would create the tension, the dialectical tension, to move upward in the Hegelian sense to the next mode of civilization. So on top of the base structure, Marx says, in Marxian theory, there is the superstructure. And so this is everything, like as it says in my document here, everything not directly to do with production. So here we have art, we have family, culture, religion, philosophy, law, media, politics, science, and education. And all of these fall under the category of ideology for Marx. And so if we come back to the term hegemony, or hegemony, earlier, if we're looking at culture and we're looking at art in relation to culture, the classic Marxist is going to see all of that as kind of a mystifying process. That what art does is it mystifies the more direct processes that are going on at the base level, where we're just fighting over material conditions. Remember back in the 1840s, when he and Engels write the Communist Manifesto, he's has their famous line, all history is the history of class struggles over material resources. And that's, of course, his break from Hegel, right? Is that, like, it's not history isn't the process of coming to know God as God created the world, and God is coming to know himself, and then I can, as my miniature person who can't see as much as God, become more and more like God through the process of history over time. Marx says, no, we need to turn back to the actual world where people are fighting over resources, material resources, for who gets to live and who dies. So there's much more of that materialistic focus in Marx. And so in a classic Marxist sense, there's going to be all of this stuff that falls under the category of ideology. Now, when we jump to the Frankfurt School and we jump to people like Antonio Gramsci, who are dealing much more actively with art and culture and hegemony, that's when we start trying to see like what the means of production are and how they're encoded in our art and culture. Hence, critical theory has to have a cultural element from the mid 20th century on up until now. That is why I've titled my center the Center for Critical and Cultural Theory, because if we don't take aesthetics seriously, then we're never going to really understand what's going on. It's hard. It's going to be hard for people in the United States who have not grown up with the idea of. I'm not just talking about nationalism or patriotism or a really surface level sense of what ideology is, as if it's like all about you like saying the allegiance to the flag or something like that. It's a much deeper sense of social control, I think, is what is going on for the critical theorists in the mid 20th century. And that discussion will change and develop throughout the 20th century. But this gets enough, I think, for now. Let me just, as I close out here, just jump into the 20th century. And this is going to hit back to things I said in lecture 1, particularly about this recent group of intellectuals calling themselves the Invisible Committee. Now, they put out a book called The Coming Insurrection in 2007. They're mostly French writers, so this was happening in France. And then it came to the United States, and nobody really cared that much about it because not very many people, except graduate students maybe, are doing a lot of work in critical theory. But what happened was the right-wing people like Glenn Beck got a hold of it, and they kind of made it famous on their media platforms. And this happens a lot. This is kind of a pattern with like conspiracy theories about the left, and then all of a sudden you have a much bigger population of people reading a book that most people in the United States would not have really understood. And so this is happening right at the time of the housing crisis and the economic crash of around 2008. And they have been calling for, in the coming insurrection, they've been calling for this thing called affective waves. How do we attend to affective waves? Go back to lecture 1, and I was talking about the French resistance and the idea that like it didn't really come from any one elite group or a center of command. It was just a feeling, if you will, an affective wave that crossed everybody that said, we're not going to take it anymore. We're not going to take these invaders. And that affective wave has its own history too. Like the Paris Commune in 1871 was one of those moments of affective waves where there's something about the moment of that creates this massive action, something that is going to be what Walter Benjamin, as I said in the first essay, first lecture, is going to call presence of mind. How do you attend to presence of mind? How do you know when it's time to go out into the streets and be active? Lots of people at the January 6th insurrection, as the media calls it, in 2021, or excuse me, in early 2021, lots of people who were there for the protest didn't necessarily see themselves as insurrectionists, but they were out. But you had people on both the right and the left there. So then you have the right-wing people blaming so-called Antifa or the anti-fascists. And so there's this kind of pointing blame going on at who's actually really behind the storming of the Capitol. What is interesting is that we've seen in the United States something as serious as the storming of the Capitol coming from the far right. and the right-wing movements, and not coming from the left. And so that's just very interesting. I've talked about this in various lectures, and I want to hold space for the impulse that draws people out into the streets. But this is quite different from like the levitate the Pentagon movement in the late 1960s, for example. So you have this like mass protest thing going on that's been associated traditionally with the left, and usually associated with peaceful protest, unless we're talking about the Weather Underground or people like that. But now what we are seeing are people showing up with their guns, to protest gun legislation or restrictions or something, or you see people showing up at the Capitol. And then you also see this shift towards law and order being embraced by the so-called liberals, right? The Biden administration, who Kamala Harris and Biden, then they say like, oh, look at all the bad things that this insurrection has happened at the Capitol, and so we need to really protect ourselves from this. And what they end up doing, even though I might have some sympathy with them and their critiques of the right wing, what they end up doing is they notch us all the way, even more as a society, to a society that is deeply, deeply entrenched in law and order politics, and social control. So from my perspective, here at the end here is both what is happening in the main parties in the United States today, whether it's the Republicans or the Democrats. They are both working in a dialectical tension that has, for the past 50 years, been pulling the entire country more and more towards the right. They work together to do it. Now, I know it doesn't seem like in Congress they work together, but what we see in Congress is this massive dialectical tension that's always happening, whether it's about Roe v. Wade or anything else. And what it is, it's like a ratchet that you keep rolling, and you're pulling it past its kind of torque. If you have like the tool, or you might tighten something too much, and eventually something's going to like burst, or maybe which way is it going to burst? I don't know, but it's that kind of frenzied air that I think that we are feeling more affectively as a populace. And what is really interesting is that in the past, because of the way critical theory has been analyzed or been thought of as always just being the critique that was made by the far left or the radical left, there's been a distancing from that, and an exclusion or an allergy to it in schools, that we don't do theory. If you do theory, you're somehow bad. You're just like an intellectual. So why should being an intellectual be bad, by the way? I mean, that's just part of the ideology, right? So why should you why should we study something like theory or critical theory? It's like, well, that's just what the extreme left does. And what we need are STEM citizens who just go and they learn how to become engineers and make money and do math and all of that. And we leave the humanities outside of that. So they don't think about ethics, don't think about civic life and what it might mean to participate in society with each other. And so we've had about 50 years of that too, as a revenge against the civil rights movements of the left. And then you have people who are nostalgic for the civil rights movements of the left, and they want to reclaim that. But that reclaiming, I would say, is very superficial right now. The games of representation that we play, as much as I like to see people of color and women in power, of course I like to see that, but the dialogue that we have publicly about it becomes weaponized identity categories as well, where it's just people pitted against each other as well. So there's more rage and friction that happens from that angle too. So let me go ahead and read the end here, and then tell you where I'm going next. We need to be critical of doing critical and cultural theory today. Means that we need to look outside of the individual, outside of the subject. We need to look at affective waves that inform us, and that inform us through culture. The intersubjective nature of aesthetics is often represented through well-known metaphors of electricity, like turning on, or ecstasis, the ecstatic. Think about psychedelics in the 60s, or like turn on, tune in, drop out, that kind of thing. Timothy Leary's line. Recently, these intersubjective waves have come to play a part in affective studies and in rhetorical theory. So if you're a rhetorician like myself, you study this stuff maybe. Theories of insurrection and religious theory. In the past decade, maybe a little bit more now, drawing heavily on Marxist and post-structural theories, a group called the Invisible Committee published a politically incendiary book entitled The Coming Insurrection around 2007 in France, as a response to riots in French suburban ghettos known as banlieues. I mean, that's not, banlieue doesn't mean ghetto necessarily, but this is the way that that it looked. It was like kind of low-class neighborhoods if you think about the United States. In November of 2008, members of the Invisible Committee were arrested by French authorities on charges of criminal association for the purposes of terrorist activity. And the book, The Coming Insurrection, was used as evidence. So what became interesting about this was that people were being charged on the idea of pre-terrorism. So you can see how floating behind this might be issues of like free speech, freedom of the press. In November of 2008, the criminal association for purposes of terrorist activity, that's what they're charged with. The book was then translated from French into English and published by a small academic publisher called Semiotext, which was then distributed by MIT Press back in Massachusetts. Then political pundits like Glenn Beck jumped on the publication as a sure sign that liberalism in the United States, liberalism, right, not just like capitalism, was under attack by academic elites, which is just an ongoing story. Like, we're the academics. Like, Roger, you bad academic, you radical leftist, you're screwing up everything, and that is why we should close down all the universities and not have public education and privatize everything. Right? That is why if we should close down universities and we should fund them privately ourselves, especially by religious and right-wing groups, and do away with the idea of a public notion. That is the right-wing impulse, right? The long game of the right wing is to destroy public education and public everything. Right? I'm talking about the far right for sure. The long game of the student loan crisis is just to alleviate the need to even give students student loans. Don't make it a program. Don't make it a government program to begin with. So ironically, the pundits gave a lot more public exposure to the incendiary ideas coming from this book, The Coming Insurrection, because of the right-wing pundits like Glenn Beck. The Coming Insurrection then served as a motivating factor for I would call him on the left, philosopher Simon Critchley, who had an exploration of this notion of political theology, which I'll do lectures on that idea, and supreme fiction in the faith of the faithless, experiments in political theology, in which Critchley calls for a return to poetry as a way to revive faith in liberal democracy. So what Critchley is trying to do is to combat against that impulse to separate everything out and privatize everything, to destroy any notion of the public. He's trying to find a new way that the public can reinvest itself in the ideas of a society, right? Critchley's calls for insurrection. So he was calling for insurrection in that, but he was tying it to art. He was tying it to aesthetics. And so we don't really understand why Critchley is interested in art if we don't take art seriously to begin with. But the critical theory tradition since the Horkheimer and Adorno and the Frankfurt School in the 1940s and 50s has always taken art more seriously and aesthetics seriously. So Critchley calls for insurrection art rehabilitated into a capital A art as a transcendent and almost Kantian, that's my reading, space or enlightenment space, in which we might work out our conflicts for perpetual peace. Now, Immanuel Kant had that kind of progressive notion that we're going towards perpetual peace, right? Hegel came in and he said, he took part of that, but he reacted against it because he wanted to be more inclusive of German folk traditions, and particularly Christian pietistic mysticism. And so there's more of, they're both, I think of them as Euro-Christian thinkers, but they both have this a tendency to frame things in terms of Christianity, but I think that there's more of that pietism going on that characterizes folk or volkishness for Hegel. But they both have that linear model that's going towards perpetual peace. While Critchley is responding to much post-Kantian philosophy since Martin Heidegger in the early 20th century, and from an altogether different politics, the idea of an insurrection has supplied a host of activist impulses in the past decade, a wave that the Invisible Committee has been writing. And that's why you see, like, I'm using the quotation marks around insurrection, or earlier I said what the media calls the insurrection of January 6th. It is not for me to say, it is for me to say, but I am not trying to say that what happened on January 6th last year is not important and very, very serious. It is very serious, but the way that the so-called liberal news media has grabbed hold of it, the mainstream media, the forces of cultural hegemony, have framed that event in terms of insurrection. What they've done is they have given the right wing the fodder to now stamp out any other public protests, so that if there are big protests that come after, say, Roe v. Wade gets canceled this summer, so this might date my video here a little bit, then the people who are subject to protesting against the erasing of Roe v. Wade in public law, they will be automatically deemed more closely to be insurrectionists and to be criminalized in terms of the wider public. Because, and not only that, because if Roe v. Wade does go away, then abortion, as it's already being set up in certain states, is going to be criminalized. So it's not even just the sense of taking away something. There's an added element that people performing abortions or getting abortions will become criminals. And so it's part of the same process by which, like, people who are like the liberal news media, they seem like they're advocating for people's rights, but what they end up doing in their language of insurrection and going for the spectacle of getting readers involved is they keep ratcheting things towards the right over and over again, because we don't have public spaces for dialogue, for intellectual discussion about how all of these forces work. We've given that away in the United States. We've given away our public culture to charlatans, to people who don't know what they're talking about, and people who want a soundbite. And maybe I'll have to make some sound bites too. Back to my discussion here. So it started with I'm using an extreme left version because the right wing was looking at the extreme left, but now the right wing are the ones who are the insurrectionists. So, as described by the Invisible Committee, they say that we need to be attentive to affective waves. The Invisible Committee says affective waves bring violence and destruction to the nation state that cannot be traced to one source, and the lack of subjectivity resists any culpability necessary for legal prosecution. No one person or no one group can be deemed responsible for an affective wave that just takes over. So this is a direct quote from them. Revolutionary movements do not spread by contamination, but by resonance. Something that is constituted here resonates with the shock wave emitted by something constituted over there. A body that resonates does so according to its own mode. An insurrection is not part of a plague, is not like a plague or a forest fire, a linear process that spreads from place to place after an initial spark. Instead, it's this type of movement, right? And so critical theory, even as some folks might say, critical theory maybe isn't just the province of the left or the right, but because there's such a fluidity between left and right, critical theory might sometimes sound like it's more right-wing or more left-wing. But I have said already that my agenda is to say that that dialectic between left and right is archaic and part of the problem. I'll still have to use that terminology from time to time so that I can communicate with my students or audience members. But that is where I'm going. So I want to get us to that kind of place, not where we try to say like that we can stand outside of it completely, because I don't think that we can. We're caught up in it. But how do we think beyond that dialectical tension? How do we actually see that maybe it might be that engine of the dialectic itself that might be causing some of the problems that we face socially today? So what looks like literary criticism in the Invisible Committee's work here, by referring to post-structuralist thinkers and affective waves, they're referring to French thinkers like Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari, anti-Oedipus projects, and A Thousand Plateaus. That's where some of that language of affective waves comes from. What looks like literary criticism here becomes justification for a terrorist insurgency with no central authority or command structure, a formulation echoed by the left-wing critic Alain Badiou's Maoist influences philosophy for militants, which is a tiny little book that Badiou put out around 2014, I want to say, in English. The question becomes one of not just the intentionality of resonating individual, but what effect intentionality has on a larger chorus. Drawing on Deleuze and Guattari's descriptions of affect with terms like becoming, assemblage, in A Thousand Plateaus, the committee notes that insurrections work like music, whose focal points, though dispersed in time and space, succeed in imposing the rhythm of their own vibrations, always taking on more density. Yet, unlike the 1960s activist terrorism in the United States, according to the Invisible Committee, I mean people like the Weather Underground, when I say activist terrorism in the United States, according to the Invisible Committee, even the Weather Underground cannot control the forces of nature. So that's an important distinction. If you've ever heard the Bob Dylan song, you don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows. That was him sort of distancing himself from the Weather Underground movement, which was setting off bombs in public spaces and in the late 60s, early 70s, a radical break from the Students for Democratic Society. The Invisible Committee has gone beyond that kind of activism, that kind of terrorism that we see throughout the kind of left-oriented movements and that come out of the student movements in Europe, in Mexico, and in the United States, that all characterize the so-called revolutionary moment of May of 1968. Definitely thinkers like Alain Badiou are looking back to May of 68 too. And so we'll have discussions more about May of 68. But my point here is that the Invisible Committee has already dealt with that. And so they're a little bit closer to our present. The Invisible Committee's appeal to nature, though, here, saying that like they're kind of saying like, well, even like you can like act like like you're the Weather Underground and instigate things, but actually even they and their terrorist activities can't actually do that. Like, it's not going to spark it. What's going to happen is this more affective wave where we're not going to know where it's coming from. And this is like, it's going to be intersubjective, right? So the Invisible Committee's appeal here to nature is pre-political and primal, as if coming from the archaic revival itself. Now I'm reading a little bit from my book, but there is this notion of the pre-political that goes back before nation states. That if we think about classic thinkers like Thomas Hobbes, he characterizes society as developing out of the pre-political. So that's where that language is coming from, and that some people who are kind of disaffected with modernity look back and they're like, well, if we could just return to a state of nature, if we could return to that state of nature where things are perennial and it's like moving like seasons, then we might be better off. I will have more to say about that in other talks and lectures, but I think what's important here is that the Invisible Committee's appeals are that's just something that the right wing just sort of like, it blows over, because they're more interested in the immediate violence of so-called insurrection. So insurrection for the committee is not a matter of a cell or an organization, but an assemblage of violence. The Invisible Committee claims a kind of becoming that happens extra subjectively. Such faith, I say, I mean, they have a lot of faith in that their left kind of movement is going to happen, this Marxian tradition. But what we're seeing, and what I keep advocating for, is that what we're actually seeing in 2021, 2022, is that the affective waves are coming from this other area. It's not coming from the Marxist tendencies. It's coming from much more far-right focuses. So the rhetoric embraces a kind of enchanted and vibrant vitalism, and the fear, and I think this is something I'm critiquing the left here, that there's this embrace of enchanted, vibrant vitalism, and the fear that the book inspired among conservatives like Glenn Beck expresses the fact that the political groups take seriously the radicals' implicit claims to be in touch with the primal and infinite forces motivating life and death. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that at least this is evidence. Like, so a lot of times people say, why do you do critical theory today? Why? Like isn't that old hat? Isn't that just Marxism? Isn't Marxism dead? All of those sorts of questions. And it's like, yeah, if that were the case, why are people like Glenn Beck reading the Invisible Committee and like spewing it across all sorts of right-wing media, right? If there was no power in the leftist movement. So I think there's power that's given to the left because the right is taking them seriously. This is again where I say that the right and left, if we're going to use that metaphor, they are dialectically working together in tension to accomplish something else. So here there's a convergence of interests around insurrectionary notions coming from the theoretical discourse of European philosophers, and a tradition among conservatives to see the critical theoretical discussion as evidence of cultural decline. Again, lots of right-wing thinkers will say, like, all those shitty critical theorists from the 1960s, Herbert Marcuse, the New Left, all of that, they are what perpetuated this ongoing decline in civilization. That's certainly the rhetoric behind Trump's so-called "Make America Great Again" type of speech, right? That kind of notion is that, like, oh, we could get back to this earlier time where things were great, and then you have people on the left who are like, when wasn't America ever great, and all sorts of discussion about that playing with ideas of narrative and historical narrative. I think more importantly in doing critical theory today is to look at this notion of force and to link it back to somebody like Hegel. Remember, because he has force and understanding. The force of understanding is progressing history in his conception. Now, I'm not saying I'm embracing Hegel's conception, but there is something to how he says dialectic works. And I will say that the right and the left work in a dialectic fashion with each other. In this convergence is an implicit hermeneutic fusion with the force of nature. The invisible committee, I argue, participates in a return to nature as primordial and pre-political, a type of what I sometimes call psychedelic aesthetics. Both the right wing and the left wing do this thing that I call psychedelic aesthetics. My book is really hard to read, but that's one way in. Thinking that psychedelic aesthetics are exclusively a left-wing manifestation is a big mistake. As the mind manifested return, so this term psychedelic just means mind manifested, as the mind manifested return to the pre-political formulates an emerging political desire, the invisible committee's uniting of affective alliance to religious violence and extreme terrorism resounds with recent studies in political theology. Thus, inquiry into the political theological roots of psychedelic aesthetics as they attempt to articulate critiques of liberal democracy will help us better understand the seemingly perpetual ruptures of insurgents characterizing the early 20th but also 21st century. I'm going to put 21st right there. So I'm going to end there for the day, which is just to sort of recap. I've started hinting at this notion of political theology. What is that? I'll give future lectures on that, but I'm trying to get us a little bit closer to what do we mean by critical theory in the 21st century? Well, we need to think about aesthetics. We need to think about culture. We need to not lose track of the discussions from Marx and Hegel and that whole tradition that influenced the Cold War and that influenced the so-called end of the Cold War. And famous writers like Francis Fukuyama, who called the end of Cold War the end of history, right? Because that was the end of the dialectic that he thought he saw between the communist or Marxian traditions of the 20th century and capitalism. Capitalism had won, and it is sort of this new era was going to come. But what we have seen since 1991 is emergent crises of all sorts of different forms. Now, the crises sometimes show up in religious terms, like 9/11, so-called radical Islam, the formation of Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, all of that sort of religious extremism there. There's the religious extremism of the United States, including the sustained attack on Roe v. Wade, which was like abortion just was not a huge issue, especially for Protestant Christians before the late 70s. But abortion became a issue that the right wing used to unite Catholics, conservative Catholics, and Protestants in the end of the 70s to create this thing called the moral majority, which was rhetoric that came out of Liberty University and Jerry Falwell and all of that. The idea that there's a silent majority of American voices, usually in the Midwest or something, that are the heart of America, and that they aren't speaking up, and that this new thing called the religious right needs to be the voice for that. Now, those efforts were part of a revanchism or a revenge against the civil rights gains of the 1960s. They were particularly against forced integration of their schools and racism. So the efforts around formulating abortion, anti-abortion as a policy were not only like the formulation of a certain kind of religious conservatism that was constructed at the time, right? It just wasn't something that a great deal of that Protestant Christians thought about before. Certain Catholics were definitely against abortion before. There's a notion of dignity of the person, and that goes back to the 1890s, Novum Rerum, I think, is the papal bull that I'm thinking of right there. And so the idea, it was entirely, the attack on abortion was entirely about a galvanizing effort to create a moral synthesis among religious conservatives, and that has become. They embraced Ronald Reagan, and they've gone in and out of favor, the so-called Christian right. But what they did was they funded lots of think tanks and tried to defund public institutions, defund civic engagement, defund humanities efforts to think about what it might mean to live together, promote neoliberalism, and promote the privatization of all education, the destruction of the public sphere. And from that, they also started their own think tanks and have grown up a whole generation of lawyers to think the way that they think. It's a very, very smart and sustained move by the right. Do not think that I'm making fun of the right-wing activists in the United States, but it is a right-wing thing, and it is religious extremism. And the fact that we don't see the attack on Roe v. Wade in terms of religion because they've stepped away from that is a big problem, I think. So it becomes a political theological problem. So I have a lot more to say about political theology because I think that informs a lot about where we're at today in doing critical theory thinking, but it needs to have the inflection of aesthetics and the cultural critique that came from the critical theorists in the early early to mid 20th century and then throughout the end. And there will be a lot more to say about, post-colonialism, about the negritude movement, about people like Frantz Fanon, and more in-depth discussions about what was happening in the 1960s. For sure, there's a lot more to be said, and a lot more to be said about neoliberalism. I know I just threw that word in there. But I've talked quite a long time today, and so I'm just going to unplug for the time, and come back with maybe some more statements in another installment of this series. But I've gotten us a little bit closer to the 21st century if you've stayed with me this long. So thanks for your attention. Please support us on Patreon if you think that there's anything of worth in this endeavor. I know it's hard. I know that it can't be just edutainment, but there's a lot of work to be done, and it's a civic effort for me to try. Thank you.